When we talk about believing in God in our wider culture, many assume faith stems from either a naive belief, perhaps inherited, or maybe a mystical, unexplainable experience. But for my guest today, his belief in God began with an intellectual pursuit, and that investigation changed his life. Vince Vitale, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Cheryl. Great to be here.
So you were studying philosophy at Princeton, and you had a friend that challenged you to study the beliefs of Christianity, the claims of Christianity. Tell me about that challenge.
Yeah, that's right. I always was someone who had big questions about life, and growing up with a sort of cultural Christianity, I found that people weren't always able to answer my questions. And so I came to the conclusion that there must not be good answers in the Christian faith to these questions. When I got to college, I was studying philosophy at Princeton, and it was actually two guys who I was playing soccer with at the time. They were teammates of mine, and they challenged me to read the Bible, which is something that I had never done before. And so I was always up for a challenge, and I began to read through. And as I read through the Gospels, first of all, I was so attracted to the person of Jesus, the sorts of things that he said: love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, do to others as you would have them do to you. These remarkable statements of wisdom and of morality. And then the things he said about himself. He claimed he existed before Abraham, someone who lived thousands of years ago. He claimed to have seen him was to have seen God, that he and God were one. And I thought, wow, this guy is making some really big claims about himself. But then as I moved into the Acts of the Apostles, what kept surprising me is that I kept coming across words like reasoned and convinced and disputed and argued and explained and examined and persuaded, even proved. In fact, in Acts of the Apostles, the word that is most used for when someone becomes a Christian is the word persuaded. And I couldn't help but come to the conclusion that actually the Bible was not asking me to take a blind leap of faith. It wasn't asking me to park my brain at the door. It was asking me to love God with my mind. And that broke a really big misconception on my part, and it at least opened me up then to the possibility of faith.
So you really dove in after that, looking at the evidence, if there is any evidence to back up the claims of Jesus, and you're surprised to find there was.
I was blown away. I didn't even think you could begin a search for evidence for faith. I thought those two things couldn't go together, that it was an oxymoron, this idea of rational faith, but that's not what I found. And again, my starting point was the scriptures. And as I continued to read through the Acts of the Apostles, I saw that it said that God had provided confirmation for all by raising Jesus from the dead. And then I continued to read, and I got to this remarkable passage in 1 Corinthians 15, where there's a list of all the people that Jesus had appeared to. And it even says more than 500 at once. And then I love this, that it says more than 500 at once, most of whom are still living, as if to say, go out and ask them yourselves. And I began to dig into that passage, and I found that even atheist scholars date that passage as an early creed within just 2 years of Jesus' death. And what that does is it blows out of the water any idea that this could have been a legendary development. People clearly believed right after Jesus died that they were spending time with him alive, and not just his friends, but also his enemies in different places at different times over a period of 7 weeks, hundreds of people. And so the question in my mind then, as a seeker at this point, my freshman year in college, was how do you account for that? How do you account for the fact that there were, in history, hundreds of people who were walking around saying, we have spent time with this man after he had clearly been killed? And I actually arranged meetings with two of the top New Testament professors at Princeton at the time. They were both not believers, and I thought they would be able to provide me with naturalistic explanations for what I was finding in this history. And one of them glanced towards a mass hallucination theory without conviction. It's a theory that's riddled with problems. It hasn't earned any credibility in the scholarly literature. You simply can't point to mass hallucination for all of the many different appearances, and not only to individuals but also to groups. And hallucinations are not something that happens to groups, they happen to individuals. And then I spoke with the other professor, and he said that as a historian he simply wasn't interested in the question. And there appeared to be this assumption that as soon as we began to talk about the miraculous, we were no longer talking about history. And I've never been able to understand why he thought you could say that, why he thought you could make that assumption beforehand, before actually looking at the evidence and seeing where it leads. So on this search and the conversations I was having and the Bible that I was reading and the things I was studying, I came to wonder with G.K. Chesterton if maybe Christianity hadn't been tried and found wanting. Maybe it had been found difficult and left untried. So that was something of the beginning of my search.
So you started finding that there was all this evidence actually to support the historical account. But what was it that pushed you to decide, no, I want to follow this Jesus?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I don't think you can be argued into faith. I don't think you can gather enough evidence and all of a sudden you're a Christian. But for me, my mind was in some ways the keeper of my heart. I needed to be shown that this held up intellectually in order for there to be a clear path for God to speak to my heart. And he began to do that in a number of ways, certainly through community. I was able to interact with a really healthy Christian community during this time, and that was such a great blessing to me. And then there was times where God began, for the first time in my life, really to bring conviction of sin in my life. And I can remember very vividly noticing, I thought, but really it was the Holy Spirit convicting me of certain things in my life, and thinking to myself, okay, well, I'll just stop that. And just thinking I'll just flip the switch on my own strength and stop doing that thing that I knew deep in my heart I shouldn't do. And I would not do it for a few days, and then I would fall flat on my face, and then try again in my own strength, and again fall flat on my face. And so there was the life of the mind and my pursuit of God intellectually that was coming alive. There was community and my engagement with God through his people. And then there was the way that God was working on my heart. And I was reading a book in my dorm room, 122 Jolene Hall. It was a book on the resurrection, actually, but it wasn't anything specific in that book. It wasn't some argument in that book. But as I closed the back cover, I think God just knew that I was ready, both here but also in my heart. And as I closed the back cover of that book, I just knew, for the first time in a personal way, in a way that so far transcended all of the calculations and the arguments and the evidence that I had amounted, that Jesus was who he claimed to be, and that he had died for me, and that he was offering me forgiveness, and that he wanted to be in relationship and friendship with me right then and for all eternity. And I was alone in my dorm room, but I exclaimed out loud, "This really happened." And I've been walking with Jesus since then.
So what happens inside of you when you make this decision? Because we always talk about that and then we just kind of move past it. But was there something inside of you that happened when you made that decision?
It is. It's so hard to put into words. I was reflecting on that earlier, and recently I had the privilege of seeing someone come to faith. And I want to share with you the first words that came out of their mouth after they became a Christian, because it resonates so well with what I think was going on in my heart when I converted, but I didn't have as eloquent of words as they did immediately after my conversion. But right after this person had prayed to accept Christ, the first words out of his mouth were, "I have always felt alone and like I had to wear a mask, but now this is the first time in my life that I can be fully myself and fully alive." And that speaks to something of the sort of color that comes into a black and white world when you accept Christ. And to get practical for just a moment, one of the things in my life is that I would never ask for forgiveness. I felt that having to be forgiven meant you were weak, it meant you were wrong, it therefore meant you were unimpressive, and it meant you were unlovable. That would not have been a good recipe for marriage.
Nope.
And I'm so thankful that one of the changes I saw in my life is that I've come to just fall in love with asking for forgiveness. Sometimes it's annoying how often I do it, but forgiveness, given and received. God has forgiven me, therefore I can ask for forgiveness from others, and I know that my value and my worth and the love that God has for me is in no way dependent on that. That is a huge change in my life, and every relationship in my life is radically different because of that.
You could be an honorary Canadian with all that apologizing. I'm just saying, it's one of our things.
My wife is British, so you're absolutely right.
I mentioned earlier that there was a cost with your family. We only have a minute left, but can you tell me what happened there?
You know, it was tough for my family. They didn't have any box to put living Christian faith into, and a few things were going on. They sent one child off to college. They got a different child back, really got a different person back. They said, we don't care if you're better or worse. We just want the son that we loved, that we sent off to college. We want him back. I think they also felt, though I didn't intend it, an implicit criticism. You're now saying this is the most important thing, and it's not something that we taught you. And then I think there was actually something of a sort of infringement on their turf. They really, to their credit, saw their roles as parents as so central to their identity. And now all of a sudden there was this spiritual father figure who was in some ways my primary parent and the one who I went to first for wisdom and discernment. I was not mature enough at the time to see that that legitimately would have been very difficult, but I'm thankful that my parents continued to stay by my side as parent, and the encouragement that I would give would be that over a long 15-year process, God was incredibly faithful in bringing me and my parents back into strong relationship and ultimately bringing them to himself as well. In any two of those years, in those 15 years, I couldn't even tell the difference, but he was doing a slow but a very good and faithful work so that those roots would be deep when they finally did come to say yes to Jesus.
I love your story. There's so much more I want to unpack, but we're out of time. But just really quickly, for someone who's watching, who has always felt that the claims of Christianity are just mystical and it's just weirdos or naive people, or it's not a thinking man's faith, what would you say to them?
I would say that if God exists, and I remember making this argument to myself as a 19-year-old, if God exists, then he made you with this brain, with this mind. And therefore, if he exists, he would want in a sincere intellectual search to point in his direction. He says, if you seek me with your whole heart, then you will find me. And so that would be my encouragement. He's made you in full. He loves you in full. He's made you with that mind and that brain. So don't be afraid of your questions. Don't feel that they're irrelevant to faith. Ask the deep questions. Find people who will take them seriously. And I believe that will lead you to the God who loves you.
Love it. Thank you so much for coming today and sharing your story.
It's been absolutely my pleasure.
You know, we find God in many different ways, and everyone's story is unique. I don't know where you're at in your journey, but if you want to talk to somebody about where you're at, if you want someone just to pray for you for some of the things going on in your life, that number's on the bottom of your screen. Give us a call anytime, day or night.